Welcome to this explainer. We're diving right into the intense, high-stakes drama and the really profound theology of Jesus' final hours before his crucifixion. Today, we're pulling from two incredibly rich sources: an in-depth theological paper by Dr. John Kimball on Luke's Gospel, and a fantastic historical breakdown by Sean Finian on the Gospel of John. Together, they paint a picture of a night that is just filled with staggering contrasts.
Okay, think about this for a second. If you knew the clock was ticking down to your final moments, what would your closing message be? It's a heavy question, right? But it perfectly sets the stakes for the extraordinary events of the Last Supper. Jesus knows his time is up, yet he uses every single remaining second to teach, model, and build a legacy that would literally echo throughout history.
Let's get into Section 1, the calm before the storm. We begin our narrative with the stark contrasts that define those final tense days leading up to the Passover feast.
There is this absolutely wild spiritual divide going on behind closed doors. Just days before the supper, Mary takes pure nard. This is perfume worth 300 denarii, which is basically an entire year's wages, and pours it all over Jesus' feet. It is this beautiful, extravagant, totally wasteful devotion. But on the complete opposite end of the spectrum, you've got Judas Iscariot. He actually criticizes this so-called waste out of calculated cold greed. And shortly after that, Judas goes straight to the chief priest to sell Jesus out for just 30 pieces of silver. To put that into perspective, that was the ancient compensation price for an injured slave.
But, our sources point out that this wasn't just standard human greed at work. There's a dark, inexplicable element here. The text explicitly says that Satan entered into him. There isn't some grand logical monologue from Judas explaining his motives. Instead, whatever initial greed or resentment was already simmering there, Satan was able to twist it, setting the wheels of injustice into motion and driving Judas to betray a man who had absolutely never done him wrong.
Moving to Section 2, redefining power and service. As the dinner actually begins, the tension in the room is mounting.
And instead of hanging on to Jesus' every word, an argument breaks out among the disciples about who among them is the greatest. Can you imagine? But it prompts Jesus to completely upend their worldview. He utterly rejects the traditional top-down view of power where you dominate others to get your way. Instead, he advocates for bottom-up servant leadership. He tells them that true authority is found by coming under others and lifting them up, saying, "Let the greatest among you become as the youngest, and the leader as one who serves."
And he doesn't just talk the talk, he gives them a visceral, shocking, physical example. You have to remember they were in a strict honor and shame society. So when the respected rabbi strips down to his underwear, wraps a towel around his waist, and starts washing the dirty feet of his disciples, it is a massive cultural shock. This was a job so low that Jewish slaves were typically exempt from doing it. Peter actually refuses in total disbelief at first, like, "No way, Lord." But Jesus insists. He models it perfectly and tells them, "Do just as I have done to you." He literally turns the whole concept of power completely on its head.
Which brings us to Section 3, the New Covenant Sacrifice. Let's look at how this simple meal transforms into a deep theological revelation.
To really grasp Dr. Kimball's academic deep dive, we need to demystify one key term: substitutionary atonement. This right here is the absolute cornerstone of Luke's theology of the cross. For a long time, some scholars argued that Luke didn't actually view Jesus' death as an atoning sacrifice, but Dr. Kimball proves that Luke places this exact concept right at the center of the Last Supper.
It's fascinating how perfectly this lines up visually. Think back to the Old Testament Passover in Exodus. The blood of a substitute lamb painted on the doorposts spared the Israelites from death. Well, at the Last Supper, Jesus is presenting his own impending death as the ultimate Passover sacrifice, designed to spare God's people from judgment and to institute an entirely new covenant.
Right in the middle of dinner, Jesus intentionally uses the everyday elements of bread and wine to signify his atoning death. Instead of pointing to the roasted lamb on the table, he points to the bread as his broken body and the cup as his blood poured out for you. The era of animal sacrifice is ending right then and there. His death is the fulfillment of it all.
Section 4, the breaking of bread. This simple phrase becomes a powerful narrative thread that echoes way beyond that upper room.
If you track this phrase across Luke and Acts, it's like a giant puzzle coming together. On the night of his betrayal, Jesus interprets his death through the breaking of bread. Then, days later in Luke 24, two disciples are walking to Emmaus, and they don't even recognize the resurrected Jesus until he sits down, blesses, and breaks the bread. Boom! Instantly, their eyes are opened. And then, years later in the book of Acts, the breaking of bread becomes the defining worship practice of the entire early church.
And this wasn't just a fleeting idea. It became the absolute bedrock of the early Christian community. Look at Paul's farewell speech to the Ephesian elders later on. It perfectly mirrors Jesus' final words. Paul tells them to shepherd the church, which was acquired through his own blood. This just proves that substitutionary atonement wasn't an afterthought. It was how they understood their entire survival and identity.
Now, shifting over to the Gospel of John, there's this incredible paradox. The literal moment Judas leaves the room to finalize the betrayal, Jesus declares, "Now is the Son of Man glorified." It's so counterintuitive. He views his impending suffering and crucifixion not as a total defeat, but as the very first stage of his glorification. As the scholar F. Bruce points out, because Jesus fully accepts the Father's plan, his suffering is as good as accomplished. The cross isn't a failure at all, it's his glory.
Section 5. A legacy of unity. With Judas gone and the cross literally hours away, Jesus spends his final moments passionately preparing his friends.
He makes them a massive promise. He's sending the Paraclete, the Helper, the Holy Spirit. And this helper has quite the job description. He's going to prevent the disciples from feeling like abandoned orphans. He'll guide them into all truth. Because let's face it, Jesus can't teach them everything they need to know in just one night. And most beautifully, through the Spirit, the Father and Son will actually make their home with believers. They are never going to be alone.
And then he gives them their ultimate marching orders. A real game changer. He elevates the old golden rule, love your neighbor as yourself, to a staggering new height. The new commandment is, love one another as I have loved you. True followers won't be recognized by their power, or their influence, or their wealth, but by demonstrating the exact same radical sacrificial love that Jesus showed them when he washed their feet and gave his life.
To wrap up this explainer, we are left with Jesus' final, passionate prayer for his followers in John chapter 17. His biggest prayer wasn't for their worldly success, it was that they may all be one. In a world that is so completely obsessed with dominance, power, and division, the text leaves us with this profound challenge. Can we embody this radical legacy? Can we actually lead through humble service and fight for true unity? It's a deeply provocative thought to take away from the extraordinary weight of that final night.